Welcome to Pushing Beyond the Obvious, and I am your host Mukesh Gupta, author of the world's first business poem, Your Startup Mentor. This is a show where I bring you ideas and insights from some of the best minds in the world so that you can be a better entrepreneur and grow your business. Today's episode of Pushing Beyond the Obvious is brought to you by Skillshare, an online learning platform with over 18,000 plus classes on business, marketing, technology, and many more. Get 2 months of Skillshare for free at rmukeshgupta.com/learn. Hi, David.
Hey, how are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back, I must say. I mean, you are probably the third guest who is back again on the show. And it's such a cool coincidence that the first time you were on the show, it was episode 9. The second time you're on the show, it's season 2, episode 9.
No, that is so cool. I thought maybe there'd be more people that have come back, and maybe that's what it is the second season is just checking in with everyone again. But this is even cooler, so thank you.
Yeah. So maybe, for people who have not listened to the earlier show, and, for people who also are new listeners for the show, and you've done a lot as well from the past when we did the episode. So can you just introduce yourself and the body of work that you've done? And then we can proceed from there.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, my name is David Burkus. I kind of look at the through line through all of my work is that I am trying to bring good ideas out of the ivory tower and bring them to the corner office or to the corner co-working space, whatever it is. But bringing people who practice. So there's a lot of really, really good research in management, in psychology, in social science that can inform how we can, I like to say, work smarter and live better. But a lot of it's written in academic jargon. And so for the last almost 10 years, it's been my mission to strip down the academic jargon and present ideas in a way that is easy for people to apply to their lives, to their businesses, etc. And so the most common way to do that is with, I now have 3 books, Mists of Creativity, which is I think what we talked about the first time mostly, Under New Management, and a new one coming out May 1st called Friend of a Friend, which is about sort of networking, making better connections, all things that you need at any stage in your career, but especially when you're in that startup phase.
Interesting. And congratulations, by the way, for being part of the Thinkers 50. How did that happen?
Oh, thanks. I have no idea. No, I was blessed to sort of literally show up on their radar, as the metaphor is. In 2015, they have this sort of radar category of people that I think, these are people that aren't ranked, but we're paying attention to them, we're watching them, etc. And then a lot of good things happened since then. Under New Management came out, it really sort of resonated. A lot of the ideas in that resonated with where a lot of people in the West, at least, were talking about, and so we were fortunate enough to have like the chapter on salary transparency ended up being adapted into a TEDx talk that then went live on TED.com because it spoke to that sort of wage gap issue that a lot of the U.S. and Europe is trying to deal with right now. So we got really lucky in that we sort of had the right ideas from the ivory tower presented to practitioners at the right time. And I think that kind of combination is good. I'm super blessed to do it, and I think it's nothing but, I obviously try and work as hard as I can, but I have to be honest, I also got a little lucky.
I know there is always a little bit of luck involved in everything that we do which succeeds, but at the same time there is a lot of blood, sweat and tears that go into the work as well. So tell me a little bit about Under New Management. The concepts of the book in terms of whether it is salary transparency or some of the other concepts. I've read a lot of blogs about it, but I've not seen such level of transparency or such level of adoption in businesses a lot of times. So what do you think is the current status now? So do you think that the ideas that you share in Under New Management are actually now being put into use in organizations? And if yes, can you maybe pick the top 2 or 3 ideas that you think were the most number one interesting or most disruptive in a way that you've seen people put into organizations and succeed?
Yeah. So the goal of under new management was kind of a merging of that corner office ivory tower idea. So I had for the longest time read a lot of different pieces in a lot of business publications about different people practices, usually led by startups or tech companies, etc., but just different ways of managing an organization than the usual sort of inspired by Frederick Taylor idea. And so the big idea of under new management is that as the nature of work changes, as it's less and less about routine, repetitive work and more about knowledge work or even creative work, solving problems, coming up with new ideas, etc., the way that we manage people will also need to change because you're managing a different type of work. And then, so that's the big idea. And then the book really dives down into each chapter is a different practice or different policy from various different companies. So, like we said, salary transparency, but also putting employees first, even above and beyond customers. The idea of not having an individual manager in charge of hiring, but turning it over to the whole team. We looked at whether or not what's going on with dealing with email overload. We looked at open offices as a trend. We looked at all sorts of different trends in the workplace. And the goal was to pair each with the psychology research that shows, well, here are the contexts in which this is a really good idea. So in terms of what's been spreading, every idea started with a little bit of a foothold. I've seen a lot of growth in a couple ideas in the past 2 to 3 years since the book was researched and came out. Salary transparency is definitely growing. We're seeing it not only, what I'm pushing for is for the private sector, for entrepreneurs and business leaders to willingly adopt it. We're also seeing it become a favorable trend inside of government regulations. So whether that's transparency in the form of having to report to the government what your salary bands are and how they break down by gender and race, etc., or whether it's pushing for things like preventing employers from asking prospective employees what their previous salary was, which levels the negotiation field, etc. So we're seeing the growth in that. I'm really encouraged by the growth in a lot of companies. We wrote about unlimited vacation, sort of popularized by Netflix, but practiced by a lot of different companies. And the gist of this idea is essentially the vacation policy is there's no vacation policy, take what time you need, but we're not going to say you get X number of days in a certain year, use them or lose them, etc. And we're seeing that trend grow along with a trend towards paid parental leave, so not just paid maternity leave, but paid paternity leave as well, and adoption leave, and et cetera. So I really think that that's growing because unlimited vacation is a really good way to solve that problem. There's a lot of different problems with paternity leave and getting it rolled out in the United States, at least, because it's not something that's beyond just some unpaid leave guaranteed by the government. So we're seeing a lot of companies move in that direction of unlimited vacation because it's easier to have that policy than to write out sort of specific policies. I'll be honest, though, the biggest trend in the book is that all of the practices and policies that we profiled are really policies of elimination. In other words, there was something in the sort of bureaucratic rule book that was blocking people from doing their best work, and the leaders of the organization saw that and decided to eliminate it. And that is the trend we're seeing move the most often, that senior leaders, employers are really getting an idea that their job is no longer to have employees report to them, but their job is to serve the front line and the individual contributors to make sure that they have everything they need to create as much value as they can. And that's a mindset shift that I really enjoy watching grow. And whether or not that turns into the practices and policies under new management, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is you've got leaders taking on that sort of servant mentality of our job is to get our people everything they need to do their best work.
Interesting. And also the fact that, ultimately it's the front line which deals with the customers. It's the front line which deals with, complaints. It's the front line which brings in the revenue. So as long as you are able to help them or clear roadblocks for them and treat them with respect, fairness, and as adults, so to say, I think they will respond in kind.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of HLC Technologies under Vinette Nair and the idea of a value zone. So it wasn't just the front line, but the front line is the biggest piece of the value zone. But the value zone is any place where there's an employee interacting with a customer, because that is the face of the company. You might be a 10,000 person company, you might be a 2-person company, but whoever is interacting with the employee or with the customer, you are the company to that customer. And so how you act and whether or not you're empowered to help that customer makes all the difference in the world in whether or not you've got a profitable long-term relationship or a one-off transaction.
Interesting. So tell me how the shift from writing under new management and friend of friends, which is your current book, and you explained the through line, but you wrote the entire book and released it in under 1 year, which should be a record by itself.
I definitely wrote the entire book in 1 year. It depends on publication for Under Management. It might be a little bit longer than that. But really it was, I attribute some of it to intellectual ADHD, right? That I just have different interests in. And the amazing thing, I'm so blessed in the world in that what I get to do is sort of research ideas that seem interesting under the pretext of I'm going to write a book about it. And I get to learn all of this amazing stuff. And the only deal I have to make is to share my findings with readers, right? And then I do that, and they sort of support it, etc. I'm really blessed in my life for that reason. But this idea, the idea for this book really came to me during Under New Management. In Under New Management, we looked at a couple different network science studies as a way to show what's going on inside a large organization. And I realized it was the second time, the first time being in Myths of Creativity, that I'd written about some of these researchers in this world of network science. And so I really just kind of decided to myself that once Under New Management was done, I want to take a deeper dive into studying networks and studying human networks in particular, but sort of all networks. And the first thing you need for that is you really sort of need to figure out what is the need. And so as I was studying all of this stuff, I realized the need is really this idea of networking and making connections. I mean, almost everybody, no matter what industry you're in, wants to have a better idea of how do you connect with the people you need to connect to grow your career or to grow your business, whatever it is. So networks are hugely important, and paying attention to your network and the network around you is hugely important. At the same time, most of the prescriptive advice out there is one person's advice. It's this worked for me, and so you should try it too. And there's some great books out there. I mean, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and Never Eat Alone, and there's a lot of great books about networking and making connections, but they're all advice. And so the idea here was that advice is great, especially if you look, act, and work in a similar sort of domain as the person giving the advice. But if you don't, the advice is kind of useless because you're not that person, so your situation is different. So what we really sought to do was go, okay, well, based on network science, there are certain principles that are universally true of human networks, no matter where you are in the network. So what if the goal is to teach better networking and better making connections through that social science so that you can arrive at something that's true for you no matter what situation that you're in. And so that's what we really try to do with Friend of a Friend. So each chapter looks at a different network science principle, some of which have been dealt with before, like the strength of weak ties and 6 degrees of separation, but others are really stuff that has been well known inside of the niche of network science academic studies, but really affects how we think about our own networks and making connections, and is sort of new, fresh material in this world of this conversation of networking and making professional connections. So that's been the goal. Initial feedback is really, really good, so I hope that means that we hit it, but I'll be honest with you, I'm reserving judgment on that for about a year or two out when we really see what the impact of the book has been.
I know, I mean, I got an early review copy thanks to you for sharing the book. I read the book twice, just to be sure.
Wow, thank you for reading it twice.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I strongly believe in is that, a book, if you really want to understand what someone is talking about in a book, you need to read it multiple times. There have been books that I've read over 30 times. For example, Alchemist is a book that I've read more than 45, 50 times. Because every time I read it, depending upon the state of mind I am in, I gain new insights. The same thing with religious texts as well. And with management books which I like and which intrigue me or create some sense of curiosity, I tend to read them at least twice. So some of the things that you've written in the book really piqued my curiosity and made me read the book, the entire book end to end twice. So the first thing that really intrigued me was the principle that you talk about in the chapter 3rd, which is become a broker and fill structural holes. So unpack that a little bit, please, for us.
Yeah, so inside of a network, so we think about, I mean, the first thing is that our metaphor of a network often, when we think about it, our professional network, is we think about it like a list of contacts on our phone, rather than think about action. When you start to look at that there are, rather than just a collection of people that you know, you start to see that networks cluster. They're not evenly spread. They're not purely egalitarian. They cluster. And so what happens is that as these clusters sort of form, where people with similar ideas who work in similar industries and have similar backgrounds kind of cluster towards each other, there's a tendency to create what the sociologist Ronald Burt called a structural hole, a gap between one group of people and another group of people. And we see this a lot of times, and a lot of the startups that really sort of bridge the gap are the ones that provide a broker between these two structural holes. So in the book, I use a couple of different examples. One of my favorites is Jane McGonigal, who is a video game designer who is working now with psychology and medicine to talk about how video games can be used to help treat and heal mental issues, stress issues, even physical health issues, which is really amazing. It only happens because Jane McGonigal took a step out and put herself as a broker between these two domains, right? And we see this in a bunch of different things. I mean, Uber, for example, is a massive company now because they essentially brought technological advances to a really out-of-date industry, being the taxi industry in the United States and the West. And we've obviously seen some pushback on that for one cluster, but a tremendous amount of value created by sort of bridging that structural hole. And the same thing applies even inside of organizations. Most larger companies tend to sort of silo off, and there tends to be all of these politics and turf wars, to use a Patrick Lencioni term, that different factions of the organization kind of keep to themselves. And it turns out that the people who can bridge those gaps, the people who can walk between two different silos, unlock a lot of value. And probably my favorite quote in that whole chapter isn't from me, but it's from Ronald Burt. And he says that the people who stand in the gap, the people who stand in the structural holes, have a significantly higher odds of having great ideas. And there's a good reason for that. If all ideas are combinations of pre-existing ideas, then if you know what's coming out of multiple different communities because you're standing in the gap, you're going to have better ideas than the people who are clustered off by themselves. So you create a ton of value for the network by being a broker, and then a lot of that value comes back to you in the form of whether it be promotions or growing your business or whatever it is. A lot of that value comes back into you.
I completely agree. I think if you look back at what we have seen around the world, people who bring multiple, either industries or multiple disciplines together and are sitting in the middle tend to be the ones that actually create breakthrough ideas and breakthrough organizations. Now, the question that comes to my mind is, what defines these people? Why is it that they are the ones who are able to do this? Or let's say, for example, if as an individual, I want to be that person who is able to fill that structural hole. What do I need to do? What kind of skill sets, what kind of mindsets do I need to have in order to, number one, understand that there are these structural holes, and number two, to identify those disparate networks and connect them?
Yeah, so later on in the book we talk about this sort of principle of homophily, the idea that like attracts like, and it's actually it's a little bit like attract likes, and then it's a lot of a network structure. Once you start to sort of gravitate towards people who work in your industry, who think like you, act like you, have the same background as you, as you get deeper and deeper towards people that are like that, the network starts to serve you new introductions that are already very, very similar. It's sort of a downward spiral or an upward spiral, depending on your point of view. It's sort of a downward spiral in that once you start gravitating towards a cluster, there's sort of a pull, and it makes it easier and easier to meet people who are similar and similar to you, and harder to meet those sort of new people. So the first thing is really realizing that, right? Doing an audit of who are the people that are around me, let's say the 10 or 15 people I interact with the most frequently, and then how similar am I to them? If I'm very similar to them, then I'm probably pretty deep inside a cluster, and I need to start taking conscious steps to work my way out. And now the hard thing is that if you're really deep inside of a cluster, you can't just ask for introductions to people who are in some other cluster, right? Because you don't know enough people. So some of it is taking a deliberate action. We're sort of forcibly going to another thing. I often encourage a lot of people to sort of crash a meeting of an organization you would never go to, just to sort of learn a bit more about them and how they see the world, etc. And if you do that enough times, you will make deliberate connections with those people. The other thing is to really realize that we need a little bit different approach to how we meet new contacts. Most of us are sort of familiar with those networking events that we all hate. And in those events, that same pull towards staying in your cluster happens. So a better strategy is usually to engage in what the sociologist Brian Uzi calls shared activities. And these are things that are not about meeting new people. They're about accomplishing some other mission. So it can be working with a nonprofit, but it could also be a sports hobby or any sort of hobby where the goal is the activity itself, and where the activity itself draws a bunch of diverse people. And in focusing on the activity, you end up sort of mitigating the effects of homophily and meeting a lot of interesting new people that'll become your introduction to these new clusters and eventually sort of put you at the hole. I wish it was so easy as just saying like, oh, well, there's a gap and I'm going to go stand in it. But a lot of it is recognizing that you are not in the gap and then taking some steps towards getting yourself closer to another group of people, another cluster. And as you do that, you will eventually find yourself standing in that gap.
So I think it also is all about inertia and self-doubt as well, right? Because it is not easy to go into a place where in a meeting where there is a different team sitting, because you always feel that okay, what will these guys think? Will they think that I'm an idiot, or they will throw me out, or even if, let's say for example, I'm an IT guy and I want to understand finance, I will be very it will be very awkward for me to go and talk to a finance guy because there is no common ground to talk about. That is where I think the activity based connection I think is a brilliant idea, because then you are introducing a constraint which is the activity, and there is a shared love for the activity as well, and by doing the activity there is some common ground that has already been created, which can then flourish into both of us love cooking, so what else do you like to do? And then kind of you can open up a little bit, and the possibility at least of building a connection or building a relationship exists. Otherwise, I've seen people trying to do this. I've seen sales guys trying to network with finance guys because they want to sell to them, or because they want to understand that function better so they can sell to them better, but without having a common ground, without having common understanding at all about something, it's just a disaster.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Well, I won't say it's a disaster. It's difficult, right? And to use the salespeople as an example, a lot of times the problem is that there's an immediate agenda instead of an exploratory one of just, I want to know more about this community and then how can I potentially meet their needs, rather than I want to know more about this community so that I can figure out the right words to use to get them to buy my thing, right? And so that's a very, very different approach. And the other thing is there's a network trick to this too. Different chapter, different principle, known as multiplexity, and really shared activities kind of help in this regard. What multiplexity is about is it essentially says that people build a deeper relationship faster with people that they have multiple different contexts in which to discuss, right? So work is one context, but then there's also, what does your home life look like? Maybe you worked with this person, but your kids also go to school together, or you attend the same church or temple or whatever it is, right? There's multiple different contexts in which we interact with humans, but our natural tendency is to put people into buckets, to think, okay, this is a work-only context, I'm a salesperson, they're in finance, right? And not to think about, well, maybe we both have a shared love, maybe we both love cricket, whatever it is. So there are other ways, if we're taking a broader approach, there are other contexts in which we can sort of first build the relationship with, build trust, and then we can ask sort of more open-ended, more exploratory questions and be welcomed as we're trying to figure out this other cluster, rather than just be seen as that salesperson that's just trying to make a sale and they're not interested in me as a person. They're interested in knowing what words I use so that they can use them to try and get me to buy stuff.
Interesting. So in the same chapter, you also share the story of the Native American sequoia. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing the name right. So can you share that story as well? And where and how did you come across this story?
Yeah, so I mean, I live quite close to where the Sequoias tribe is now. They're based. Their headquarters, their capital, if you will, is Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So it's one of those stories that you sort of always know. Interestingly enough, it was a very late addition into the book because mostly we were looking for another answer. So Sequoyah was a Native American. Sequoyah worked in and around a lot of settlers, a lot of white folks, and worked as a silversmith and saw really this fascinating thing. I mean, it's almost hard in as literate a society as we are in now. It's almost hard to visualize this idea that he's working as a silversmith, but he doesn't. His tribe does not have a written language. They have a spoken language, obviously, and then he sees English. And over time, he's realizing that these settlers can communicate with each other without actually talking. They can just scribble down symbols on pieces of parchment and communicate with each other. And as he learns what that is, he starts to realize, well, wait a minute. This is an idea from a different tribe of people that would really, really benefit my tribe. And so he sets about, is really one of a few examples in history of a written alphabet being created by just one person. But he sets out to bridge this gap between and bring this skill from one cluster to another. Interestingly enough, as often happens, this new idea is not necessarily welcomed. He actually gets put on trial for witchcraft from his own people until he can prove to them that, no, this is what we've created and why. And it really unlocked a tremendous amount of value in that it provided a skill that his tribe did not have, that the Western settlers did have, and allowed the tribe to sort of interact with them better, to trade better, etc. And really was one of the reasons that tribe is in where I am in Oklahoma. We have this reference of the sort of the 5 civilized tribes, which is a really kind of an offensive term, but it basically is a judgment of who were the more technologically, literarily advanced tribes as Europeans were settling the continent. And Sequoyah is the whole reason, really, that his tribe was considered to be one of those sort of civilized or more advanced tribes, and one of the reasons for their success and existence even today.
Interesting. I also feel that you are also one of those people who identifies clusters and kind of connects through clusters. You take information and knowledge from disparate fields and bring that to a totally different field. So, do you agree with my thinking?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So I don't know that I would have used, until a couple years ago when I'm familiar with this research, I don't know that I would have used the structural holes term or the broker term, etc. But you're exactly right. That's always been the goal. From the time I was at university and sort of started to read the works of the first brokers between social science research and practice, to use a great, probably the most famous is like your Malcolm Gladwell's, but Chip and Dan Heath and Dan Pink and a lot of people now are in that space, and we need as many voices as we can, because there's a lot of good stuff that's coming from social science that takes a while because it's written in jargon. It's almost written in another language. Often it needs to be translated. It needs to be brought over to that. So yeah, I've bet my whole career on that idea that these are two clusters that need to interact more often, and so we need to build as many brokers between them as we can.
But the question then to ask is, why is it that academicians use language that business guys can't understand? You're an academician yourself as well. So if you can write such beautiful books, sharing stories, then why can't other academicians write similar papers?
So it's a question of jargon and language, and also a question of incentives. We'll start with incentives first. Most academics, if you're thinking of just growing your career inside of the academy, then all you have to do is impress a very right. So the people who are deciding your promotions and the people deciding your tenure, they don't necessarily care about something like being ranked by Thinkers 50, right? They care about where are you publishing and are other people citing your work and how influential inside of the community of other researchers are you, and that's all that matters for growing your career and being successful, right? The other thing is jargon, and there's a good reason that different clusters develop their own sort of shared language, is that once you get a community of practice, a cluster of people, you need sort of more refined language. You need to be able to define things in terms that the broad level of the entire society doesn't necessarily need to know, because you're never going to have that conversation except inside that cluster. So over time, you develop these sort of new ways of using words and new words, and you develop this kind of jargon that if you're not in the cluster, you don't understand how that is spoken, etc. So it's a mix of predominantly incentives. There's really no incentive in academic life to be interacting with practitioners all that much. But the other thing is that because it's a very clustered group of people, they speak and use terms that practitioners don't necessarily know, and my thesis is don't necessarily need to know, because the broader, more general terms matter more.
Interesting. So in the same chapter, you also talk about a quick exercise as well to figure out whether someone is a broker or not. Can you just share that as well?
Yeah, I have to pull up my own book to make sure I get it right. Hang with me 1 second as I do that, because I don't want to give you the wrong piece of advice. I'm pulling up we have a workbook that we have for anybody that orders the book and registers, and that's a shortcut to the activity. I want to make sure I get it all right, because I've got to also describe to you the worksheet to do it in. So the biggest thing is figuring out, right, are you who are you interacting with most in your career, and are you interacting with people from a diverse set of industries? So what I encourage people to do is you can do this. We have this worksheet in the workbook that has these 3 columns, but you can do it yourself. Basically, take a piece of paper and draw 3 vertical lines, create 3 columns going downwards, and in the leftmost column, list 10 to 25, 12 or 15 is fine too, but list somewhere in double digits the number of people who have been most influential to your career. So this is providing guidance and advice. This is making you aware of job openings, the people you work most closely with on projects, etc. So fill that out. Make a list of those people. And then in the middle column, who introduced you to those people? In other words, how did you get first connected to this person? Right? And then in the final column, list anyone that you've introduced that person in the first column to. Right? So we have 1 column of names of people that I interact with most, and then we have 2 columns next to it that are how did I get connected and who have I also connected to. And the thing to do is to pay attention to recurring names. So if you fill out this whole list and there's one person's name that appears multiple different times in multiple different contexts, connecting you to new people, but also you're connecting them to new people, etc., then the chances are that that person is actually the broker for your network. They're the one providing new opportunities and new information, etc. On the other hand, if the majority of your third and final column, in other words, sort of who are you introducing other people to, then again, the odds are good that you are not that broker. So if you know that, right, now you know you can start to be a little bit more deliberate, right? If that third column of people you're connecting other people to is really, really full, then the chances are that you might be that broker. And so that's good. Regardless, you have a really good idea of sort of where you sit inside the cluster. If there's a strong diversity of names, then you're on the periphery and you're more likely to be discovering those opportunities to be a broker. If there's a lot of the same names, especially in the second column, and that name is not you, then the odds are you're actually very deep inside of your cluster, your community of practice for your industry, and we need to take some steps to get you connected to a bit more diverse set of people.
Interesting. So again, there is you, as with everything else in this world, there is a flip side to of the coin as well. So you share the story of the Italian glassmakers. Can you share that? And these seems to be 2 sides of the same coin, and something that people need to navigate as well.
Yeah, so this is what's interesting, right? You can leave that chapter, everything we've just talked about, and really believe that, okay, well, what this means is that clusters are a bad thing, and I need to have a strong diversity of people. But there is a reason we as humans have developed our networks this way. And the reason is that, to some extent, we need clusters. We need communities of practice where we can have that shared language, right, that I was talking about earlier with academics. We need that. There's been several studies that show that a society needs that because ideas need to spread from cluster to cluster. They don't spread sort of egalitarianly through a whole network all at once. They move from community to community. So we need those kind of communities. The trick is knowing how often we need them. So I use this example, and Stephen Johnson was the first one that made me aware of this example, and he writes about it probably far more beautifully than I do. But he talks about this interesting thing that happened in Venice. And essentially, Venice is known for its glass makers, but the interesting thing is for hundreds of years, its glass blowers, its glass makers have not lived in Venice proper. And the reason is that making glass, you have to have a lot of heat. And when you're a series of wooden structures built over a canal, having lots of heat can also mean fires and burning the whole sort of city down. And so eventually the city of Venice decided that we're not happy with these people. We love their trade, but we're not happy with the fact that often they burn the whole city down. So they forced all of these glassmakers to move to Murano, a short little series of islands just across a canal from Venice. And, you would think if the lesson from the previous chapter is that clusters are always a bad thing, you would think that this is bad because it's making it harder to fill structural holes. It's making the structural hole bigger, if you will. But the truth is, there's a benefit to being in a cluster. And so the practice of glass blowing and making, whether it be vases, whether it be beads, whatever it is, the practice grew and really exploded in creativity and in opportunity and in value because of this cluster. Because what was happening is you had a cluster of community practice that you could work with to learn technique, and then you would sail across the channel, and to sell, you would have to be interacting with a different group of people. And so the trick really is it's not just about being a structural whole and not finding a home in either community. It's about being able to go to a community of practice for a time, benefit from the shared language, benefit from sharing knowledge and growing and sharing ideas, and then bringing those ideas somewhere else. So the trick is to sort of vacillate between a cluster and a community that sort of needs you. And again, to go back to Jane McGonigal, she's actually a great example of this. It's not that she feels unwelcome in the world of video gaming and in the world of medicine. It's that she has penetrated both clusters, and she can come to both for a time. So the trick is to learn who is that community of practice that I need. Entrepreneurs need other entrepreneurs to discuss a bunch of different issues with, but you can't just hang out in entrepreneurship conferences all the time. You'll go out of business, right? So you need that community, but then you also need to break away from that community for a time. I actually think the best metaphor, it's not in the book because I didn't think of it until afterwards, the best metaphor is that these clusters ought to function like the way that a ship in a harbor works. A ship in a harbor is safe, it can be rebuilt, it can be reloaded, it can get lots of all new things that it needs for a journey, but it can't stay in the harbor. There's no value created by it just staying in the harbor. Eventually it has to sail out, and that's when it creates a lot of value, but it also refuels and repackages value when it's in that harbor. The trick is not to be in the harbor all the time.
Very, very nicely said. The other analogy that I could think of is like, heartbeat. So, you need to expand, contract. You need to move between one to the other, and on a regular basis, so that, you don't get too attached to either one of those communities. So you cannot stay in one place for too long. You need to go to that place, go to that network of or communities of practice, as you call it, and then move out. Then come back in, move out. Come back and move on. And if you can do it with a regular frequency without getting attached to either one of the communities, that's when the true trick is.
Yeah, no, it's exactly. It's a good analogy.
Yeah. So tell me something. One of the things that I have noticed, whether it is in your writing, whether it is Stephen Johnson, whether it is Dan and Chip Heath, whether it is Dan Pink, so all of you guys take some interesting research that is being done and present it in such beautiful stories. So one of the things that most entrepreneurs also struggle with is to be able to share such beautiful stories. So what have you done to learn the craft of storytelling, despite being in the academic world where you could easily fall into, as you said earlier, the curse of knowledge, so to say.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, this is where I have a little bit of an ace up my sleeve, a little bit of a trick, in that I was an undergrad English major. Oh. So I came to university thinking that I was going to be a writer, just thinking that I was going to be a novelist, right? And then when you discover, you're 19 years old, you don't know anything. When you get there and you discover that there's far more genres than just fiction, right? And that you go into university thinking the dilemma is, am I going to be James Patterson or Ernest Hemingway? And then you realize how many other genres there are that you could work in. This is the one that I was sort of really attracted to. So some of it is that. The other thing is really, I think, all of us. I can't speak for Malcolm, Stephen, and Dan. I can maybe speak for Dan. All of us have adopted a way of sort of really collecting stories. It's not a matter of sort of telling and writing down stories well. It's a matter of having a broad scanning of the environment and collecting stories as you find them. So I'll give you a great example. So I have different tools like Evernote, etc., to do this, but I'm always sort of trying to keep track of when I hear a good story that I think relates to a study that I've read or something like that. I'll try and file it away. So a great example of this, the Winter Olympics just wrapped up, and Team USA won the gold medal in curling. Right now, this is interesting for myriad of reasons. One is that more Americans like to joke about how boring curling is than actually support it. So it's amazing that Team USA won. The other thing is that I heard this story about the team that actually won, the team captain and all of the other members. Essentially, Team USA had struggled with curling for a really long time, and so the governing body, USA Curling, decided to do a little bit different trick. After the 2014 Winter Olympics, they basically decided, you know what, we're going to develop this high performance program. We're going to find new talent and cultivate it for 4 years and get it ready to then go to the Olympic trials and then go to the Olympics. And they told basically every member, including the former team captain of the 2014 games, that you are not welcome here, right? You're not in this high performance development plan. So the team captain goes and collects basically a team of other people who've been rejected from this high performance development plan, and they start to train themselves. They adopt the name Team Reject because they were all rejected by USA Curling. They start to train with themselves. They start to work very closely. They go as a team to the Olympic trials and they win the right to go represent the United States. And of course, if you're USA Curling, right, you are thinking, oh no, this is going to be a disaster. And then they go win the gold medal, right? And so, this is just an interesting example. And in my mind, I'm reading it and I'm thinking about some research from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Thomas Roulet in Britain, who does fascinating studies on, or has done fascinating studies on when communities, when businesses feel like it's them against the world, when there's negative press, but it's seen as a way of like, well, they don't really understand us and that's why they're resisting our idea, it can have a galvanizing or a motivating effect on the actual team. I mean, he does studies that explain why Team Reject was so motivated to win after being rejected by the rest of it, right? So this, to give you an example, I don't know where that's going to go yet. That might turn into a book, it might not. But the idea is you're reading these studies and then you sort of collect these stories that happen over time and you file them away and maybe they become useful and maybe they become not. But the other thing is that, again, the way that you do that is you have to be in a structural hole. You can't just be in the academic world. You also have to be constantly up on what's going on in business literature and other domains so that you can connect those two things. I really shouldn't have tipped my hat on this idea because if I do use it, this is the first time I've talked about it publicly. But there we go. Please don't steal my idea, anybody who's listening. But beyond that, that's how it sort of works, right? So you kind of collect those stories by being a structural whole. Now that said, I can't speak for how Stephen or Malcolm works, etc. But that's been kind of my trick, is just to be always scanning for those stories and filing them away, and hopefully they're useful later.
Interesting. So one of the things that I had a conversation with a guy called Harold Jarkey, and he has this blog around personal knowledge mastery, and he talks about this framework called seek, sense, and share. So he talks about the same thing. You need to have your radar on and find stuff that is interesting, and what he tells, which is different here, is in order for you to internalize it, you first read it, you understand it, and then you share it with someone in order for you to internalize the story itself. So by the act of telling the story or sharing this information with someone, you are actually able to internalize the story much better than you would otherwise, is his contention.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Another way to say the same thing is James Altucher, the podcaster and author, turned me on to an idea that actually originates with Frank Shamrock, who is a mixed martial arts fighter, retired mixed martial arts fighter. And he calls it the principle of plus minus equals. In other words, in your life, if you're looking to develop, then you need someone plus, someone who can add and teach you things, someone equal, someone who is walking in the exact same spot along the journey as you, and someone minus, someone for whom you can teach the things that you're learning from the plus, because you can't master them until you can sort of teach them, right? So same idea, that you find it's finally complete and you finally internalize this lesson when you move all the way through plus minus and plus equals and minus.
Interesting. So that's a very, very nice way to put the entire journey of someone who's wanting to constantly grow.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And again, I mean, I hate to be so self-promotionally. It speaks to the importance of understanding your network and who's connected to who and all of that.
Yeah. So tell me something. I mean, we are getting close to the time that we have on the show. So if you were to, address a group of entrepreneurs and you had, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes to give actionable advice based on the research and the stories that you've put together in your book, what would you ask them to do after listening to this conversation? 3 to 5 minutes.
I mean, I hope that they buy the book in triplicate. But really, really, I think the biggest thing is a mental model that needs to change. This is the biggest thing you can do to help, which is to move away from the idea that when I say network or when I say connections or contacts, don't think of a list of people that you know. That's good, but that's only one element of the network that you're in. The better mentality is to adopt that you exist inside of a network already, and that your job is to act accordingly to navigate that network, to figure out that network so that you can provide the most value to it, and then in turn it will provide you the most value. So that I'm going to just actually leave it at that, because that mindset shift will make all the difference in the world in terms of what actions you take next.
That is very, very nice. So let's just shift conversation to a set of questions that I ask all my guests now. So first one is, have you recently changed your mind about something or belief about something? And if yes, what was the belief and what made you change the belief?
So, I mean, I'll guess I'll share one that's been sort of high profile. So I came out at first when I was researching salary transparency. The idea made me really uncomfortable, and I get that, right? It's uncomfortable to share what you make with other people. And then doing the research, I came out very, very for, everybody in a company should know what everybody gets paid. The truth is, over time and interacting with practice, right? So taking the research to practitioners, you find that in reality, a little bit more nuanced approach happens. And so I originally thought that practices, I actually spoke about this earlier, practices by lawmakers preventing companies from asking employees what their past salary was, prospective employees what their past salary was, would help, and all of these other things. And the truth is, it's a very sort of nuanced thing. And what I am sort of now in favor of is a much more democratically chosen, inside of a company voluntarily chosen process, because I'm seeing the benefit that happens when a company decides to do it internally versus when lawmakers or regulators decide to have it done to them. And you see a much quicker adoption in that regard, right? So I won't say it's a complete 180-degree turn, but it's definitely been a mind change in what I need to be advocating for, which is not, hey, by any means necessary, let's make salaries more transparent, because that just creates a lot of backlash. It's that, hey, there's real value for an organization to pursue this, and so I want you as leaders of an organization to voluntarily adopt this idea.
Interesting. So the second question I have is that, is there any resource which has deeply affected you positively, of course, which you would like to share with our audience? It could be a piece of art, book, documentary, movie, whatever, outside of your work, of course.
So probably, I mean, outside of religious texts, one of the most recommended books that I tell people to read is Roger Martin's The Opposable Mind. And Roger is a brilliant thinker. He was the dean of the Rotman School of Business in Toronto for a really long time. Just a brilliant, brilliant thinker. And The Opposable Mind is really about the people, especially entrepreneurs and business leaders, the people who create sort of the most value in an industry are the people that can hold two mental models in their mind at the same time. And so, to give you a quick example, Roger uses the example of the Four Seasons Hotel, which is a high-end luxury hotel that also tends to feel like you're at home, right? It's not the Ritz-Carlton where you feel like everything is white glove service, high, stuffy, almost elitist service. And, those are great. I love the Ritz-Carlton. But the Four Seasons is going after a little bit different thing. They want you to feel at home in addition to feeling well served. And those previously were ideas before the Four Seasons sort of came out that were seen as contradictory. And they, as a company, figured out a way to sort of blend the two. Now, the cool thing is, so I often recommend The Opposable Mind. The cool thing is, Roger finally listened to me. That's not true. He probably listened to most of society saying, hey, this is great, but we need the instructional. And so he and a couple colleagues recently wrote a new book called Creating Great Choices, which is the prescriptive. It's the instructional on how to adopt an opposable mind. So I would actually recommend to people both. The Opposable Mind is sort of the what, and Creating Great Choices is the how.
Super. So, is there anything that you researched and you wanted to have in the book but did not end up in the book that you would like to share with us?
Well, I wish I would have known the story of Team USA curling before, but it hadn't happened yet. I'm actually trying to think. Interestingly enough, this time around, often in writing, there's a book that there's a chapter of the book, etc., that gets cut. This time around, there was one that was sort of on the borderline, which is the chapter about building teams from all over your network instead of staying with the same trusted, true people. At first, I was thinking maybe that doesn't need to be in there, and then I kind of had a mindset shift on this book that it's more than just sort of a career guide. It also should be a manual for leaders, for entrepreneurs, for everybody to go, here's how networks work, including the network inside of your organization. So I would have answered that had we decided not to go, you know what, okay, let's put it in there. It might, if you picked up the book expecting a career guide, you're also going to get a leadership manual. And if you picked up the book looking for a leadership manual, you're also going to get a career guide. And so that's been a big benefit sort of it. It's makes it a little bit disjointed in what I was thinking, but I'm glad that we decided to keep it in. I know that's the opposite of the question that you asked, but that's the best I can offer.
Interesting. And, the last question that I always ask all my guests is the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So what do you think is so obvious, but people miss all the time?
That the other side is not evil. So I live in the United States. We go through cycles of being incredibly politically polarized and incredibly united, and we are currently at the peak of a cycle of polarization. And one of the things that you see is if you're hiding in your cluster all of the time, then you don't know enough about the opposing side to attribute positive motives to them. You just assume they're wrong, and the reason that they're choosing to persist that they're wrong is because they're evil. In reality, they have a different way that they see the world, and they're doing what they believe to be the most moral, the most right, and the most useful thing. They just have a different perspective as you. And so I know that this is one of those things that I know that we say and we try and teach our kids it, but the truth is we're all really bad at this, myself included. And so I'm trying every single day to remind myself that the other side is not evil. They just see the world differently, and then they're trying to do the best that they can to create value for the world and to serve the world and make a more moral world based on their worldview as well. And this is useful whether you want to adopt a more centrist approach or whether you want to persuade the other side to come to your point of view. Nothing useful happens until you can adopt that mentality that the other side is not evil.
Interesting. So what do you do to ensure that, or at least try to not have that kind of a view?
So, I mean, I have to remind myself of this every single day. The truth is I'm in a little bit better position than most people. So I grew up in New England, which is a very, very democratic, very liberal, very blue, as we like to say, part of the United States. And now I live in Oklahoma, which is a very red part, very, very, very conservative, et cetera. And so because of that, if you think about networks and structural holes, et cetera, I sort of have a brokerage between these two communities as a whole. And so the biggest thing I try not to do is not get lost to one cluster or another, not to observe that pool. And so I'm uncomfortable a lot because I find myself interacting with people who are on the opposite pole, or who are in the center when I'm not, or I'm in the center and they're not, whatever. But I try and deliberately resist that pull of homophily to just be in one side or the other. And it's been hugely beneficial for me living in those two different worlds, having friends and childhood acquaintances, and this whole sort of story of growing up in one part of the country and then living in the other has been hugely beneficial.
Interesting. So thanks a lot, David, for talking to us. Please let listeners know where they can find out more information about your books and about all the other stuff that you do, including your podcast, your blog, and all of the others.
Yeah, so the absolute best place to go is davidburkus.com. Burkus is the last name. I'm fortunate in that I have a really awkward name, and I'm one of only a few David Burkuses in the world, which means I usually get the right domain name quickly. So davidburkus.com is the best place to go. From there, you can find out more about the book. We got a ton of free resources on that site, so if you don't want to check out the book right away, you just want to learn a bit more, ton of free resources on that site, one of which, as you said, is the podcast. So I encourage you to check that out. I would love to have you. If you're listening all the way to this, you're part of a very special end of the podcast club for this show, and so I want to invite you and reward you with that by coming over, enjoy some free resources on me at davidburkus.com.
Super. So thanks a lot for taking time and talking to us. Have a great day.
Thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Pushing Beyond the Obvious. If you like the show and would like to support, please head over to iTunes or wherever you are listening to this show and rate us and write a review. Till next time, have fun.